the howl of a hostile jet engine, the deep boom of heavy cannon fire, a flash of red and chrome. These were not sights or sounds that American pilots were used to. After all, they enjoyed complete air dominance over the Korean peninsula. But clearly, that was all about to change, as North Korean MiG-15 jets screeched into their formation of P-51 Mustangs, shooting one down before anyone could really react. November 1st, 1950 marked the beginning of an aerial counterattack that the Americans were not prepared for. A paradigm shift in how air combat would be fought from this point onwards. These North Korean MiGs, with their suspiciously competent and Russian-speaking pilots, would prove to be the end of many American aviators. The West's straight-wing jet fighters were no match for the Soviet swept-wing menace. But the Americans would soon have a swept-wing menace of their own, patrolling the North Korean skies, the F-86 Sabre. F-86 pilots would meet the MiGs head-on, embarking in one of the bloodiest, longest-lasting, and most equally matched aerial battles ever fought, over a highly contested area on the Chinese border known only as MiG Alley. So, who came out on top? Which Cold War combination of aircraft, training and tactics was superior? The best pilots on both sides flying the most capable fighter aircraft their countries could offer, with only one objective: get the other guy before he gets you. Welcome to Dogfight, 1951, Crisis over Korea. Before we could compare the aircraft, the pilots, or the tactics, we first need to get some context. Where did these two aircraft come from? What role were they designed to fill? And why do they look remarkably similar? Well, the answer to that last question, believe it or not, lies in Nazi Germany, or what was left of it. In the aftermath of the Second World War, the Western Allies and the Soviet Union carved up Germany, as we all know, including her advanced fast jet research. As I spoke about in my German jets video, these were not practical designs, at least not for the situation the Nazis found themselves in. However, they were admittedly very capable. The Americans captured Willy Messerschmitt and his P-1101 prototype, along with his aerodynamics team. The Soviets, advancing from the east, captured Berlin and all the technical documents, design plans and wind tunnel data reports from the Reich Air Ministry. But Focke-Wulf and their innovative TA-183 Hunchback design models were captured by the British, who then shared this information with the Americans. Anyway, perhaps not surprisingly, the TA-183 is the grandfather of both the MiG and the Sabre. But before this absolute mountain of captured data could be inhaled by American scientists, the US Air Force had already put out a request for a new jet. North American, the designers of the P-51 Mustang and B-25 Mitchell, were about to submit their own design, the NA-140, a denavalized version of the Navy's NA-138, which would go on to become the FJ-1 Fury. But before it was submitted, North American had a peek at the German data, and decided a highly swept wing would be far superior, withdrawing from the US Air Force competition to redesign the aircraft. The contract was instead won by the straight-winged Lockheed P-80, a character we will run into later. The German data that these designers at North American were so interested in centered around swept-wing technologies and near supersonic flight. And this is actually very important for both of these designs, especially when they came up against one another, so I'll try and explain very briefly. Air travelling over a wing accelerates as it does so. It's an integral part of how planes fly. However, this means the air going over the wing is going faster than the aircraft itself. So, as aircraft got faster and faster, and started to approach the speed of sound, Mach 1, the air travelling over the wings would go supersonic, while the aircraft may have only been going at Mach 0.7 or 0.8. This is known as the critical Mach number of a plane, i.e. the speed of the aircraft at which the air over its wings is supersonic. But the issue is not with the air going fast, it is when the supersonic air must slow down again. When the air slows down below supersonic speeds around halfway along the wing, it creates a shockwave. This is not good. The shockwave is essentially a wall of pressure, meaning that the air moving through it is slowed down considerably, creating drag. Boo. It can slow down so much that it separates from the wing entirely, causing even more drag. Both of these have massively negative effects on maneuverability as the control surfaces are at the very back of the wing. The more you try and speed up, the bigger the shockwave, the more drag. But if you sweep the wing, i.e. angle it backwards, this changes things. Instead of all the air going in a straight line over the wing, you split it into two components. One is going across the wing, and one is going down the wing, but only the first component accelerates. Basic trigonometry dictates that this component is shorter than the original, which means the air is accelerated less, meaning you can go faster before you reach critical Mach and get punched in the mouth with shockwaves and drag. I hope that made some sort of sense. But the question is, how far back do you sweep? Surely the farther the better. Not quite. It's all well and good having a swept wing when you're going fast and have a lot of air going over your wings, but planes do still need to land and take off. The more sweep, the higher the stall speed, and the trickier it was to maneuver at lower speeds. So it's a balancing act. Hence the adoption of variable swept wings, like on the F-14 or the Tornado. For the F-86 though, the Americans balanced it at exactly 35 degrees. They also used advanced leading edge slats along most of the wing, which could be extended at lower speeds to increase lift. The F-86's fuselage was essentially just a big aerodynamic tube designed to fit an Allison J-35 jet engine, which provided over 4,000 pounds of thrust to the pilot, who also enjoyed a roomy cockpit, a large bubble canopy, and an ejector seat. The design, then known as the XP-86, first flew on the 1st of October 1947 to thunderous applause. The XP-86 reached 618 miles per hour in level flight, breaking the world speed record in September and first going supersonic in a shallow dive on March 1st, 1948. The Americans had managed, with the help of some questionable Germans, to get the critical Mach number all the way up to Mach 0.95. Of course, the design looked so promising that the US Air Force had already ordered 220 of them back in 1946, with the production aircraft to be armed with a more powerful J-47 GE-1 engine, 2 underwing hardpoints for bombs or drop tanks, and a reliable arrangement of 6 Browning 50 caliber machine guns mounted in the nose. By the time the North Koreans invaded their southern neighbours in June 1950, the US Air Force had 5 frontline fighter wings equipped with the F-86A, boasting 75 jets each, and they were going to need them, because the competition was just as good. But before I tell you all the crazy stuff the Soviets were up to, a word from this video's sponsor, Raycon. Now, you may have heard of Raycons before. They provide the same audio quality as the big brands, but at around half the price. Raycon has sold over 3 million pairs of earbuds already, and they're not stopping there. Their new, upgraded, everyday earbuds have just been launched, with everything you liked about the original but with a bunch of improvements, a more ergonomic design, multi-point connectivity, and my personal favourite, active noise cancellation. Bliss. Seriously, with the other brands offering the same features at double, sometimes even triple the price, why not try Raycons? There really is no better time to upgrade, and you'll probably be annoyed you didn't pull the trigger sooner. I've been using mine for around a month now, and they've been great. An incredible 32-hour battery life and a new ergonomic design allows them to stay on and in my ears almost all day, when other brands would start to hurt after just a short while. And for me, as I'm sitting at my desk for long periods, editing or writing scripts or arguing with you all on Discord, that's incredibly important for me. They truly are my everyday earbuds. The only downside is I now must listen to my voice all day in perfect clarity. Click the link in the description box or go to buyraycon.com/RWF to get 20 to 40% off your Raycon purchase plus free shipping. You'll get a great pair of earbuds at a great price, and you'll help support the channel as you do so. Win-win. But back to Mikoyan, the Soviet aircraft manufacturer, who are about to make some bold decisions. Unlike the Americans, Mikoyan's design was built from scratch, using the TA-183 as a base to work from. They took the barrel fuselage, straight-through engine and T-tail, but decided that some aspects of the Hunchback could be improved, like the Hunchback itself. Instead of having the cockpit and fuel tanks on top of the engine, they put them in front of the engine. A more streamlined design, but a lot longer. The engine in question was a reverse-engineered Jumo 004, the same power plant seen in the ME-262. You may remember that the ME-262 used 2 of these, and for good reason. It produced under 2,000 pounds of thrust. They were in a bit of a pickle. And they were, hilariously, saved by the British government. Yes, in one of the most ridiculous diplomatic and engineering blunders in history, the Brits sold them 25 centrifugal flow Rolls-Royce Nene jet engines. But don't worry everyone, the British made them promise to not use them for any military applications. Klimov immediately reverse engineered it, and Mikoyan put it straight into the MiG-15. The Nene 2, now known as the Klimov RD-45, produced 5,000 pounds of thrust. The trade-off for the 150% increase in thrust came in diameter. Centrifugal flow engines are wide. This meant the fuselage had to be wider to accommodate it. Short and fat aircraft are quite unstable aerodynamically, so they had to increase the size of the vertical stabilizer to stabilize things. A large tail makes it harder to roll properly though, so the wings were given a 2-degree anhedral, tilted down, to compensate for this. So while the massive engine was nice, it came with some aerodynamic cost. Mikoyan came to very similar conclusions to North American, opting for a 37-degree swept wing, but their less advanced manufacturing techniques meant that the wings were thicker and slightly weaker than those seen on the F-86. The MiG's anhedral wing meant that there was too much air flowing down the wing, reducing lift, so they added these wing fences to the top surface to guide the air over the wing and onto the control surfaces. The MiG-15, then known as the I-310, first flew on December 30th, 1947, and while their performance was phenomenal, there were some issues. Rolling was still difficult, and at high speeds or high G, the MiG could flick suddenly into a spin due to its lack of yaw stability. A bigger tail might have fixed this, but would have made it even harder to roll and vice versa. Pilots also struggled to see, especially on landing approach, thanks to the relatively deep-set cockpit. It also had a lower critical Mach than the Sabre, at 0.92 Mach compared to the Sabre's 0.95. Not a huge difference, but the Sabre's boosted control surfaces meant it was still stable and flyable at speeds greater than 0.95 Mach, whereas the MiG 0.92 limit was serious. If you went beyond, it would be almost impossible to stay in control of the aircraft, as flow separation meant you would almost immediately lose all directional stability. There was also the small issue that, due to manufacturing defects, the wings of a MiG-15 rarely were exactly matched, meaning pilots would experience a phenomenon known as wing drop, where the aircraft would suddenly start to roll violently at high speeds. Oh well. Luckily, all the pilots who will fly this aircraft in combat will be incredibly well trained. Wink wink. Full-scale production of the MiG-15 was ordered in December 1948. It was intended primarily as an interceptor, climbing fast and to incredible heights to destroy American B-29 or B-36 strategic bombers, and the armament reflects this. In the nose of the MiG-15 is a 37mm cannon on one side and twin 23mm cannons on the other, the kind of guns tanks were armed with about 8 years earlier. Anyway, now we know what we're working with. In the blue corner, a precision-made, high-tech dogfighter with all the bells and whistles and a reliable flight profile. In the red corner, a more manic, aggressive interceptor, harnessing raw power to accelerate faster, climb farther, and hit harder than almost every aircraft that came before it. The Sabre had a higher top speed, the MiG could accelerate faster. The Sabre was better at diving, the MiG at climbing. The MiG could make tighter turns at high altitude and high speeds, but nearer the ground the F-86's leading edge slats would give it the edge. The MiG hit hard with its 3 cannons, but fired slower and had less ammunition when compared to the Sabre's machine gun sextet. It was anyone's guess which aircraft was better. Luckily, we were about to find out. 25th of June 1950. North Korea invades South Korea. Korean War. The United Nations intervene. American P-80 jets quickly establish air dominance over the North Korean IL-10s and Yak-9s. American bombers go completely ape, flattening almost every target on the Korean peninsula. UN forces landed in Incheon and pushed the North Koreans back to the Chinese border. China did not like this result and prepared for a counterattack. They recognized they would need air cover for this as they advanced over a series of vulnerable bridges on the Yalu River. The North Korean Air Force had been obliterated, and the Chinese PLAAF was nowhere near ready, so the Chinese commenced intensive training, learning from Soviet pilots who were deployed in China. In the meantime, these Soviet pilots from the 151st Guards Fighter Air Regiment were the ones providing air cover, with the stipulation they could not stray over the North Korean border and cause an international incident. They were forced to watch on as Chinese Yaks were hounded by American Mustangs as they attempted to cover the advancing Chinese forces over North Korea. The sheer volume of Chinese troops was a shock to the UN forces. Those bridges needed to be destroyed to stem the tide. The bridges that had Soviet MiG-15 fighters as their protection. On November 9, 1950, an RB-29 recon aircraft was hit by heavy cannon fire and crashed on landing, killing 5 crewmen. The next day, another B-29 was shot down on a bombing run, the crew becoming prisoners of war. The air dominance had evaporated, just as the UN needed it the most. The culprit was the MiG-15. On the evening of the first B-29 loss, the US Air Force Chief of Staff ordered 2 jet fighter wings to deploy to the Korean theatre. The 27th Fighter Escort Wing, flying the F-84 Thunderjet, and the 4th Fighter Interceptor Wing, flying the brand new F-86 Sabre. The Soviets deployed their own forces in anticipation for the American response, including 2 elite Soviet fighter units, Lobov's 303rd IAD and Kozhedub's 324th, based at the Donggu and Langtao air bases respectively. These units were manned almost exclusively by aces of the Second World War, with Kozhedub himself having 62 aerial victories to his name. Following a brief period where they were forced to fly from Japan, soon the 4th FIW was redeployed to Suwon and Kimpo air bases following the United Nations counteroffensive that pushed the Chinese back to the 38th parallel. But the UN still needed the bridges destroyed, and the Soviet pilots weren't about to let that happen. The bridges sat right across the border from the Soviet air bases in an area now known as MiG Alley. There had been MiG vs Sabre skirmishes in 1950, but April 1951 was when the showdown really began. The elite 324th launched their first mission on April 3rd from Langtao, flying south across the Yalu and climbing as fast as they could. On this occasion it was not fast enough, as they were pounced upon by a formation of Sabres, who shot down 1 MiG and damaged 2 others beyond repair. 1 F-86 pilot ran out of fuel following the skirmish, however, crash landing behind enemy lines. The Soviets weren't happy. We'd lost a pilot and 3 machines. The event showed us clearly that one shouldn't engage the Sabres without providing oneself with an advantage in speed and altitude. The Sabres would have complete freedom of action and attack and strike our airplanes with ease. The Sabres were only a part of the problem for the Soviet pilots. The more pressing issue was that bridge after bridge were being destroyed by American B-29s. Stopping these bombers was, after all, the task their aircraft had been designed to do. And they did it incredibly well. April 12th saw the largest air battle so far over MiG Alley. A large formation of American aircraft took off to destroy another bridge on the Yalu. 39 B-29 superfortresses were escorted by 54 F-84 Thunderjets, with top cover being provided by 24 F-86 Sabres led by Colonel John C. Mayer. 3 waves of 14 MiGs each dove onto the formation, screeching through the neatly arranged American aircraft, spraying cannon fire. The F-84s weren't quick enough, but the Sabres followed the MiGs down, being shot at by the MiG pilots and B-29 gunners alike as they attempted to close into machine gun range. They managed to damage 5 of the attackers, but at great cost. 3 superfortresses were on fire, plummeting downwards. 1 more was heavily damaged, crashing on landing, with 4 others sustaining serious hits. B-29 crews knew April 12th as Black Thursday. This continued for the rest of April, with the Soviet pilots shooting down a total of 6 B-29s at the loss of 8 MiGs, with 1 Sabre lost to fuel starvation. Kozhedub, the leader of the 324th IAD, was concerned at this ratio. He probably didn't even realise it was as bad as 8-1 either, as the Soviet used gun camera footage to verify their kills. This seems foolproof, but the gun camera would only be rolling when the pilot actually had his thumb on the cannon trigger. This meant that they would capture a hit, the camera would cut off, and they'd chalk that up as a kill. In reality, Sabres would get hit and manage to limp back to base, so the Soviet kill claims are greatly exaggerated. Of course, overclaiming kills has been happening since aerial combat began, but the gun camera film grading method proved especially unsuccessful. Anyway, concerned even with his false figures, Kozhedub traded his MiG-15s for their improved variant, the MiG-15 bis, getting a shipment of jets straight from the factory. The MiG-15 bis was fitted with a much more powerful Klimov VK-1A engine, providing 6,000 pounds of thrust. The interior structure was redesigned to accommodate this. The ailerons were made 21% larger to help roll the aircraft, the speed brakes were tweaked, and the aerodynamics were generally improved across the board. The BIS enhanced all the positives of the early model, while alleviating a lot of the negatives. By the end of May, with the full arrival of Major Lobov's 303rd IAD at Dodongu Air Base, there were 153 MiG-15 BIS guarding the Yalu. There were only 44 F-86As at Suwon Air Base. It was the Soviets' turn in the sun. Important to note here that the Americans weren't sure who they were flying against. They had their suspicions, sure, but the MiGs they were dueling over the Yalu Valley were carrying North Korean markings, and the pilots were wearing Chinese uniforms. The Soviets at this point were even speaking Chinese to each other over the radio, but this quickly broke down in a dogfight. After all, the Soviet Union was not officially involved, and the VVS pilots were told to avoid battles near front lines or coasts to avoid being captured. For the 4th IAW Sabre pilots, it didn't matter all that much anyway, they had a job to do. The skirmishes continued, intensifying in June as the communists tried to wrestle air superiority from the UN using the improved MiG-15 BIS. And by this time, both sides had figured out their tactics, adapting and improving those used by their pilots during the Second World War. Both factions used a classic 4-aircraft formation, called a 4-ship by the Americans and a Zveno by the Soviets, meaning flight. This formation was split into 2 pairs, with a shooter and a cover, with the pairs watching each other's backs. In a typical MiG Alley sweep, the American squadrons within the 4th would launch 3 4-ships together on a patrol sweep or a close air support mission: red flight, blue flight, and yellow flight. Each of these flights would fly in the wide patrol formation, with each wingman around 300 feet behind and 35 degrees abreast of their lead, just close enough to read the big FU number on the side of the lead plane. This was for good visibility during patrol, but when the enemy was spotted, the wingmen would move tight to their element lead, around 200 feet and 55 degrees behind him, just close enough to read the tail number on the lead plane. These 3 flights would form a layered defense, based on the assumption that the MiGs would be flying above them when any dogfight started. Flying at around 35,000 feet, red flight would be in the lead. 10,000 feet below them, blue flight was waiting at 25,000 feet, and 5,000 feet below them, yellow flight would be flying just above the strike force. The Soviet MiGs flew in a very similar element formation as the Americans, albeit slightly wider and farther apart. But when the Soviets left and they were replaced with less experienced Chinese and North Korean airmen, this 4 MiG Zveno was outclassed by an American 4-ship. They had to instead fly in flights of 6 jets, with 3 pairs instead of 2, and flying at slightly different heights. It was less flexible, but more difficult to break down. When attacking an American formation guarded by Sabres, the Soviets deployed their jets as follows. A lead formation of 2 Zvenos, 8 MiGs total, would take the high ground at 45,000 feet. This would be the element to attack the Sabres, usually red flight. With them in this first strike was a lower group the same size, flying at 35,000 feet to harass and disrupt the lower formations of Sabres and the American strike aircraft. Around 5 minutes later, a large MiG group of 16 aircraft would join the fray, taking advantage of the chaos to screech in at around 20,000 feet and attack the American strike aircraft, with a smaller 8 MiG group covering their attack from the marauding Sabre escorts. With fuel and ammo running low, the MiGs would depart, with a reserve group at the back keeping a close eye on their comrades and ensuring Sabres would not enjoy easy kills. It was an incredibly interesting game, with new tactics and techniques being trialled constantly by both sides. Does red flight stay high to engage the lead MiGs, or do they drop low to help the strike group? Does blue flight climb to help red flight or dive to help yellow flight? How does each 2 aircraft pair best help the other pair? In March 1955, long after the war had ended, Sabre ace Frederick Boots Bless wrote a book called No Guts, No Glory, answering most of these questions and giving his tips and tricks on how to fight MiGs with nice little illustrations. Cruise at high Mach. A good wingman never loses his leader. Look around. And my personal favourite is this, implying Sabre pilots are sneaky little mice trying to stab cats with forks. Amusing or not, No Guts, No Glory was originally classified, but it's been since released, and there's a link to it in the description if you fancy a read. While you're there, it would mean a lot if you consider subscribing to the channel to see more content like this, or joining the Discord to get involved in the discussion. Anyway, the final tallies in June were 7 MiGs destroyed with 4 pilots killed, and 4 Sabres destroyed with 3 pilots killed. It was better, but it was not enough. Stalin then urged Mao to send at least 8 Chinese fighter divisions into the fray, providing them with 372 MiG-15s to train on. The Chinese said they would be ready by November. Over the summer it was monsoon season, so duels were few and far between. In the 6 engagements over the summer period, the Americans remained on top, destroying 10 MiGs for only 2 Sabres. A reason for this dominance was likely the arrival of fresh pilots and new aircraft, F-86Es. The E model incorporated a brand new flight control system and an all-flying tail, with the entire tailplane moving. This gave F-86 pilots a massive advantage at high-speed duels, turning and changing directions at incredible speeds. All in all, 45 F-86Es arrived, alongside 30 F-86As and a whole host of new pilots. Despite the F-86's advantage in a one-on-one duel, they still couldn't protect the bombers from the Soviet pilots. On a mission over Namsi, a formation of 9 B-29s, 55 F-84s and 34 Sabres were set upon by 84 MiGs from the Soviet 303rd and 324th IADs. 3 B-29s went down, 2 crash-landed at Kimpo, and 3 more were badly damaged. No MiGs were lost. This was Black Tuesday, and prompted another 75 F-86Es hastily being sent into theatre. In October, daytime bomber operations were stopped entirely. The MiG's apparent difficulty in shooting down the F-86 may have been to do with its guns, or its gun sight. The Americans enjoyed state-of-the-art radar gun sights that would compensate for the speed and range of the target automatically, making the Sabre jocks incredibly accurate. The MiGs, meanwhile, were using reverse-engineered British gyroscopic gun sights designed for the 303 Brownings mounted on Spitfires and Hurricanes, which were adjusted manually by the pilot. If the MiG turned at a rate of more than around 4 Gs, the gyro in the sight would tumble, making it completely useless for the rest of the fight. Additionally, the mixed weapon load meant that often the slower 37mm shell would whiz underneath a Sabre, with the faster 23mm ammunition flying above the F-86 pilot's head. The Sabre would then break, evading the MiG completely. Sabre pilots called this joining the 6 o'clock club. The Chinese and North Korean MiGs arrived in November, deploying to bases and bringing the total number of communist MiGs to nearly 600. At the same time, the 51st FIW became the second F-86 wing, converting from the older F-80 Shooting Star into the cutting-edge F-86E. The Americans were smart about this. They took a lot of experienced Sabre pilots from the 4th with them, ensuring there was a mix of seasoned veterans to lead and instruct the less experienced pilots in the wing. American pilots were rotated in and out of combat duties individually, ensuring there was always a portion of capable, experienced aviators. The Communists notably did not do this. When the war-weary 324th and 303rd were finally replaced in January 1952, they all left at once, replaced with the newly trained 97th and 190th. Only 20% of these pilots had flown in World War II, and none in Korea. This gulf of experienced pilots showed immediately. In the first 2 months of 1952, they lost 27 MiGs with 62 damaged, only managing to down 5 F-86s in the process. Somehow this was about to get even worse, as F-86 pilots were now allowed to chase MiGs into Chinese airspace to secure the kill, attacking them when they were most vulnerable, coming in for a landing. Over the next 2 months, another 34 MiGs would be downed, 17 of them during takeoff or landing. The Soviets could not land or take off safely, and were at times unable to stop Allied strikes on bridges and infrastructure due to the aggressive Sabre pilots hawking their airfields. The last large engagement featuring Soviet pilots was, as luck would have it, on the 4th of July. Out of 50 MiGs launched, 11 were lost for the loss of only 2 Sabres. Morale was at rock bottom, and Soviet pilots wouldn't play much of a role in the rest of the war. The Chinese and North Koreans would take up the mantle. They did not do any better. Mao had acknowledged that there would be some losses in combat, but they were not prepared for the magnitude of the loss. By the end of May 1952, after only 6 months of operations, the Chinese had 75 MiGs destroyed and 27 damaged out of a total force of 294. They had no experience, minimal training, and were still flying the older MiG-15, no match for the American aces in their vastly improved F-model Sabres, which had a larger engine that allowed the Sabre jocks to climb to the same altitude as the MiGs. The F-model also had a larger wing, discarding the leading edge slats to allow the Sabre pilots to maneuver with the MiGs at high altitude. Even when the Chinese got the MiG-15 bis at the end of May, losses mounted, requesting another 154 jets just to keep strength up. Replacing the lost pilots was even harder, leading to even less experienced aviators at the controls. Meanwhile, the UN strength only grew. The 8th Fighter Bomber Group had transitioned from Mustangs to F-86s in January. The 18th FBG swapped their F-80Cs in February, and soon South African and South Korean pilots were also flying Sabres. By mid-1952, the air dominance the UN had enjoyed early in the war had been completely restored. During 1953, the Soviets lost 47 MiGs and the Chinese lost 84, compared to just 19 Sabres downed. Before these appalling loss rates could be in any way remedied, the ceasefire came into effect. MiG Alley had seen its last dogfight. It was clear that the Americans and the F-86 Sabre had come out on top. It would be relatively simple to conclude it was the far superior aircraft. But if we have a closer look at the statistics and the context, we can see a different picture being painted. Sorting through the horrendously exaggerated kill claims on both sides and analysing only logistical logs, official reports, and the recently declassified Soviet and Chinese documents, we do have semi-accurate numbers to look at, thanks to the authors and experts Douglas Diddy and Warren Thompson. The Americans lost 224 Sabres, with 47 pilots killed, 65 missing, and 26 captured. Of this total, 40 were lost in accidents, 61 to non-enemy causes during operations, 18 to anti-aircraft fire, and 1 to a biplane dropped bomb. This means that 104 were lost to aerial combat, 92 of which were shot down by MiG-15s. Soviet records state that 335 MiG-15s and 120 pilots were lost in Korea, with 319 of these aircraft being shot down in MiG Alley. All but 10 were downed by F-86 Sabres. Chinese records admit the loss of 399 aircraft in Korea, 224 of which were destroyed in combat, all by the Sabre. North Korean losses are difficult to figure out, but a defector in 1953 stated around 100 had been lost, about 30 of which were to Sabres. This gives us a total of 92 Sabres lost for 566 MiGs, a kill ratio of 5.835 to 1. Pretty convincing. However, against the Soviet pilots that were roughly equivalent to the Americans, the men of the 324th and 303rd, this dropped significantly to just 1.4 to 1. Only counting combats with the improved MiG-15 bis, this drops to 1.2 to 1, and this doesn't include the American bombers and strike aircraft lost over this period. Once these elite Soviet units went home though, we see the kill ratio shoot up again to an absolutely staggering 9.07 to 1 in favour of the Sabres. If you're still with me, it's relatively obvious that the MiG-15 bis and the F-86A were evenly matched aircraft, with their own suite of strengths and weaknesses. The difference was in the pilots. Newly trained Chinese and North Korean pilots, with very few hours in jets, were never going to be able to outmatch America's best aviators in their state-of-the-art aircraft. As the sun set on the Korean War and the skies over the Yalu River were silent once again, both sides took the lessons learnt and applied them to their next series of fighter aircraft. The MiG-17 and MiG-19 were sleeker, faster, and more refined, with the MiG-19 becoming the USSR's first real supersonic fighter. The Americans developed the F-100 Super Sabre, correcting the F-86's greatest weakness by replacing the machine guns with a quartet of 20mm cannons. The F-104 took the quest for speed to the extreme, but both these American designs lost the maneuverability that made the F-86 so deadly, and were no match for the nimble MiG-21 over Vietnam. And maybe that could be another episode of Dogfight, a style of video I hope I can make more of. Pitting aircraft or armoured vehicles against each other is, after all, a lot of fun. If you have any ideas for future dogfight videos, do leave a suggestion in the comments on my Discord, or consider joining the Patreon for just $2 a month to get videos like this early and ad-free. As always, thank you to my existing patrons, do consider subscribing, and I'll see you all in the next one.